We'll move to the former presentations. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Prime Minister, my two Irish friends, I'm very pleased to be able to just be part of this idea which cropped up when I was meeting in the Parliament House with the Prime Minister, the Attorney General and Minister of Tourism, and we got to talking about Ireland, and being an Irishman, I'm very au fait with what actually happened after the crash of 08 and 09 when they came to power in 2011. And I said, I think there are many analogies between the two. And it hit me sitting there. I was not there for planning this meeting. It was, I said, what if I brought these two gentlemen over to tell you about what they went through and what they did? Because the evidence today, Ireland is the fastest growing economy in the European Union. It is now at a level that it was at before the crash. And it is a very harmonious and successful small island. A little bit bigger than here, but still a small island in the overall world. And they've set an example for many, many countries. So I'm going to let them speak now, but I will emphasize the fact that this is what Ireland did, and for you to absorb and adapt to what's relevant for Barbados. It is not a management consulting company coming and saying this is what you've got to do. Just these are the lessons from Ireland, and we just hope that there'll be some nuggets here that will help you on your path to bring Barbados back as one of the world's leading economies. So I would now like to hand over to Prime Minister Enda Kenny. Enda?
Well, Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't come here to tell you what to do, nor have we come here to dictate to you what you should do. Rather, we come to tell you a story. It may be relevant to your position. You may find some of the issues that we had to deal with in a country a little larger than your own that may be of benefit to you. So, I was elected at the age of 24, 44 years ago. In that time, I've been through 13 different elections. So this is not Ireland, and Ireland is not Barbados. But believe me, people will not elect you repeatedly if they do not trust you, and they don't have respect for what you do. And in our democracy, politics is always about the people and never about oneself. And government is about making decisions in the greater interests of the nation and the people. So we've had a long history over many centuries of being colonized by Britain. The first people who came here from Ireland were sent here to work in the sugarcane plantations, and many were passing through to Australia, being sent there to Van Diemen's Land, which was Tasmania. In the 1840s, we had the complete failure of the potato crop with an enforced great hunger of famine. And our population dropped from 8 million people to less than 4 within 40 years of that. So 2 million died, another million emigrated both to England and to America, with the result that in the last 2 centuries we now have a diaspora in the United States of about 35 million people who say on their birth certificates that their ancestry is directly Irish. That had implications for our country, because while those who went out first worked on the railways and the docks and the roadways and the farms and the factories and became involved in trade union politics and in local politics, in state politics, in Senate politics, and eventually to the White House on a number of occasions, Ireland's reach as a small country is very disproportionate to many others, particularly in the United States. We're the closest island to our nearest neighbour is Britain, with which we have very good relations. And 1 million Irish people live in Great Britain. 100,000 Irish people serve on the boards of British companies. And very shortly after I was elected as Prime Minister in 2011, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II came to our country on the first royal visit in 100 years. And that happened because of the relationship between two women. She as Her Majesty, and from our part, the first woman President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, who later went on to serve in the United Nations as the High Representative and did a great deal of work in Africa and is now chair of the Elders, but also is a very strong proponent of climate justice, not just climate change, but climate justice. But when Her Majesty came to Ireland, she said, in respect of our history, she said, when we look at history, some things we might have done differently and some things we might not have done at all. So we had a difficult relationship over a number of centuries. You had a great rising in 1916 in the middle of the Great War. That was followed by a war of independence against Britain, and then a treaty negotiated between Michael Collins and Lloyd George, which resulted in the partition of Ireland, with the northeastern portion remaining as part of Britain, which has been the subject of a great deal of trouble on occasions in between, and is now the subject of an internationally binding treaty called the Good Friday Agreement, brokered by America, by Europe, with both governments, because in the 70s and the 80s you had 3,000 people who were killed, butchered, maimed, assassinated, disappeared, and so on. And the unknown consequences of the Brexit decision can have implications in respect of that if it's not handled sensitively and correctly. And when I was Prime Minister, we agreed with David Cameron and indeed with Theresa May as Prime Minister that there would be no return to the kind of a hard border with customs posts on it, which brought with it sectarianism and criminality and obviously consequential deaths. So when I responded here to Mr. Isdell on behalf of his invitation from the Prime Minister, and we're very happy to be here, let me tell you, Prime Minister, I said I should bring Mr. Michael Noonan with me, whom I had the privilege of appointing as Minister for Finance, which proved to be an outstanding choice in the most difficult economic circumstances that our country faced. It needed somebody with experience, somebody who was able to command respect among his peers at the European level, because we are a central member of the European Union, one of 28 countries. So you weren't just negotiating on your own behalf or with yourself. You were part of the rules and the regulations of the European Union. So in 2008 and 2009, when the recession hit globally, we felt the consequences of that like no other. It meant that interest rates were 15.2 in Ireland. You were blocked out of all the markets. Unemployment was 15%. You were hemorrhaging thousands of people every week, being forced to emigrate to find employment to keep their families alive. You had hundreds of thousands who were not able to pay mortgages. You had banks collapsed. You had construction companies collapsed. You had estates all over the country left in an unfinished state. We called them ghost estates. And in the middle of all that, it was necessary to have an understanding that if this was to be sorted out, the social partnership would be an essential element of that solution. And when Michael speaks to you, he will tell you about what he did, both in the context of assuming office when the Troika or the IMF were already in Ireland and their programme, but how we worked not just with them, but also put forward a programme for Ireland itself. And he will explain that to you, I think, clearly. So, you know, we're bound by the regulations and the treaties of the European Union. We've written constitution. And if we decide to transfer authority to Brussels on any major element, the Attorney General of the day may well say, if you're going to do that, you need to have a referendum to get authorization from the people. So in the middle of the recession, we had to have a referendum on the fiscal stability treaty, or the conditions that applied in respect of monies in a European context. And you might think that when times were really difficult, that people would use that opportunity, to give the government a real lashing. But what they did in Ireland was to vote for those regulations 60-40, recognising the scale and the nature of and the extent of the problem. Now, I want to say this. We would not have been able to sort out our problems unless we got a real buy-in from social partnership. And social partnership may have begun in the beginning about the prevention of strikes and about bargaining for increased wages. But in Ireland it evolved to something far more comprehensive. For instance, the judicial system and the legal system was a closed shop in Ireland. Somebody, a young man or young woman with the capability of becoming a really good lawyer or eventually a judge, essentially were blocked out. The same applied in the medical profession. And through the connections that we would have and the availability to members in the private sector or the public sector or trades unions, these things became very important in a political sense. So we're a small island. As when I was Prime Minister, or when he was Minister for Finance, people all over the country could walk into his office and say, I need to talk to you about this. I've got a problem here. Here's an issue that I think government should address. So we changed the nature of the way that budgets are presented. The Minister introduced a system of having a spring statement so that everybody would see what the books were like. But then we had publicly televised audiences with a social partnership around a big table in this room this size, that everybody would have their say in the preparations and the consultations about the budget for the following year. Normally ours are presented in October. So sort of in the month of June, it's already over in Ireland for this year now, all the social partnership would arrive in, the farmers, the teachers, the public servants, the private sector unions, the construction sector, a long, long list. And they would each have their appointed time to make their case to government in public, televised, as to how they would see the situation up ahead. So I would say to you, it's really important that you stay your ground here, because when you get into government, there's always a rush of adrenaline to say we can change the world overnight. It's not that simple. And when you set out a program and a strategy, it really is important that you have trust in the government and what they're telling you, and that they follow through on what they do tell you, but that you in turn believe that and stick with it through to the end. So in our case, what I introduced was, let's say this gentleman was the Minister for the Environment, and his program was part of the overall strategy for government. So on a quarterly basis, he would have to present to Cabinet the changes and the steps that he had taken to complete his element of government strategy, and we would then present that in a televised public forum so that everybody knew what the Minister was doing on behalf of government and how he was getting on with social partnership in general. So we had a system of not just consultation, but there was bargaining going on with the political process directly. For instance, for low-paid workers, we introduced a system of having a commission look at recommendations for lower-paid workers and what their increases in wages might be. And government said, whatever you recommend on the basis of thorough analysis and accurate facts, we will honour. So it wasn't a case of, you go into government and because you're Union X you're going to get this, and because you're Union Y you get something else. So essentially, Ireland cut the cost of the public service by 20%. And because social partnership was directly involved, there wasn't any strike from any of the trades unions, doctors, teachers, nurses, members of the police force, local authority workers or public servants, because they all understood the depth and the scale of the recession. So when I would go to Brussels, to European Council meetings, let us say that there was an issue being discussed about the common agricultural policy, which is so important to a food-producing nation like Ireland. The Farmers Association, or the Dairy Farmers Association, or the Sheep Farmers Association, would all turn up in Brussels, as the case might be, to show their solidarity with the government, but also to make the case that they were watching government to see that they would make the case for them in the context of decisions to be made at the overall level. And that's the sort of partnership that is very valuable, in that you can see and hear about changing trends and issues that might arise. So that's really all I want to say to you. So we can have a question and answer session after this. But for me, I said on the day I retired from the position of the Prime Ministership, it's never about oneself, because your remit in politics is finite. And you get an opportunity to do things early on that you will not be able to do if you let it drift for too long. And that's why it's really important in discussing with the Prime Minister here that government engaging with the social partnership. There's also an engagement and a response from social partnership. We know where the horizon is, we know the objectives we have in mind here, and we can achieve them if we work together. Of course, in politics, there are times you have to give out and criticise. This is very important for members of trade unions and members of groups to know that they're voicing the opinions and the concerns and the anxieties of any individual group. This is quite natural. At the end of the day, you've got to make a choice. Like, do we believe that Barbados can be the #1 island in the Caribbean in 5 years? Do we believe it can be the #1 in education, in health, in industry, in productivity, in foreign direct investment, in assisting small Barbadian firms to be able to export, in inspiring the young people? Say, I really want to live at home on this island. I want to be part of the movement that everybody around the world will know that if you want to do it properly, you do it like Ireland and you do it like Barbados.
And the only qualification I have to that is that we want to be the best small island state in the world, so that you get to be the best medium island state and we get to be the best small island state. Michael?
Prime Minister Taoiseach, and ladies and gentlemen, it's good to see you all here this morning on this beautiful island of Barbados. And I must say, since Enda Kenny and myself came, we've got a great welcome and a great interchange with people in Barbados. Social partnership is, in my view, essential to the running of modern democracies. And it's particularly social partnership, and an effective working social partnership is particularly necessary in smaller countries where, in effect, everybody knows everybody else. Now, Abraham Lincoln, the great United States President, before he became president and before the Civil War in the United States, made a keynote speech which went into history as the House Divided speech. And it was on the issue of slavery. And he said, "A house divided will not stand," was the key theme in it. And we found, when we were trying to rescue our country from bankruptcy, well, we knew very early on that a house divided wouldn't stand either. So there was no point in trying to impose a program dictated by the IMF or the European Union and transmitted by the government unless we got buy-in from the representatives of the people and from the people themselves. And at one level, people are represented not only by their parliament but also by the leaders of their groups, whether it's employers' groups or trade union groups. It's the first element of rescuing a country from bankruptcy. If the house is divided, you fail before you start. So you have to have the buy-in from everybody. Secondly, Enda mentioned that at one stage we had to cut public service pay for between 15 and 20% on the public pay bill, even though the imposition was different for different levels of income. But the overall effect was a massive reduction in the public pay bill. And I asked a trade union leader of the civil service, I said, why are you agreeing to this? Like, this is totally different from the practice of trade unions, who constantly argue for better wages and better conditions for their members. And now without a strike, you're agreeing this massive reduction. And he said, we're agreeing it, he says, because we live here. And our families are here. And we know we have to fix the country for the future. And, I think that's an idea that I will present to you as well. You live here. The future of your families is here. So you have to do whatever is necessary to get the country back into a viable economy and a viable democracy again, where people benefit from the sacrifice they are making by a higher standard of living and better opportunities for their children. And I'd say that at the start because I recognize, like Enda Kenny does, the importance of social partnership. But I'll give you just a historic example and a modern example of how partnership can work in a functioning democracy. We had dreadful problems in Ireland. We had what's known as the Celtic Tiger, which was a bubble economy based on building and development. And it drained resources from all other sectors of the economy. And people were buying 2 and 3 houses on borrowed money. Because the house values in theory were inflating so fast, you could buy and sell within a 12-month period, make a lot of money. But of course it was a bubble economy. And when the banking crisis occurred then in the United States and spread internationally, it hit the banks in Ireland, and the banks were left with a whole lot of bad debts to developers and builders. And the banks in effect collapsed, had to be rescued. So we were bankrupt. And I suppose the definition in the modern world of being bankrupt is that nobody would lend us money at any interest rate. And because there was such a shortfall in taxes, and because we still had all the government expenses, there was a huge gap between what we were spending and what we were taking in tax. And if we hadn't got help from the outside, from the IMF and from Europe, we'd have to make an overnight adjustment, which literally would have put 1 million people out of work and would have really destroyed the country at that stage. Now, what the program did for us was, instead of doing it overnight, it gave us 3 years to make the adjustments. And it was a difficult program, but we got time. And when we did what was necessary then, and we got the economy growing again, after 3 years we got back into the market and we were able to borrow at low interest rates. And at present, people are queuing up to give Ireland money, and you can get money at negative interest rates. The Irish state now, I think the last loan, we got a couple of million for a discount of 0.5%. So, it can change dramatically very, very quickly. So what do? First of all, you pull together. That's the first thing. And social partnership is the key platform on which a society can unite around a set of objectives. Secondly, don't be thinking of the program being an IMF program. You have to take ownership of the program. Now, it's easier to do that if you have an input into the formation of the program. And, we had to a certain extent, but a lot of the program was handed down to us as well. But you must take ownership of it, and it must be your program. And when you talk about it, you have to say, this is the Barbados program, this is the program that we own, this is the program we're implementing. And if you have leaders of social partnership, our government ministers, talking out the sides of their mouth and saying, we really don't want to do this, it's imposed on us. And this isn't our idea, this is the crowd in Washington and the IMF. As soon as that starts, and if it spreads, it undermines the program and it makes it more difficult. If you take an example in Europe between Ireland and Greece, Greece never took ownership of the program. Greece never took ownership of their program. And 10 years later, they're still in trouble. Whereas we got out of the programme after 3 years because we took ownership of it. So my second piece of advice, after saying you must be united and have unity of purpose and unity of action, second piece of advice is make it your programme. Take ownership of the programme. Sign on for the programme and be advocates of the programme, because the programme will deliver the kind of economy you want and the kind of society you want. The third thing is, I've read a lot of IMF programs, and there's a problem with IMF programs that the IMF are well aware of, and it's this. If you take an economy and you increase taxes, and then you cut public expenditure, you're reducing demand in the economy. And as you reduce demand in the economy, you make it very difficult for the economy to grow. And unless you have a parallel strategy, you're going to arrive at a situation where the program is in place, it's being implemented, but it's not lifting the economy like you'd expect that it should. So what we did in Ireland is we had a parallel program where, on our own initiative, we designed strategies for every sector of the economy. And we brought measures in to grow sectors of the economy. For example, like Barbados, we had a very strong tourist industry. But we had priced ourselves out of the market, and it had become uncompetitive. So what I did was, with Enda's support, we had a VAT rate of 13.5% across certain sectors of the economy. For the tourist product, we cut it to 9%. So we took 4.5% off of it, even though we were raising taxes elsewhere. And of course, when you think about it, when you take 4.5% off a tax, you know, that runs to the bottom line. So a lot of quasi-bankrupt tourist enterprises were made solvent again. And some of them cut their prices, and they were able to attract in extra tourists into the country. And the following, and it was a quick effect, because we introduced it going into the summer in one season. By the following tourist season, they were up and running again, and confidence was back in the sector. As well as that, we had a travel tax, and we abolished the travel tax. And we abolished the travel tax after discussions with Michael O'Leary, who's the principal shareholder and director of Ryanair. And what we did, we said, look, okay, you want us to abolish the travel tax, we'll do it, but what will you do for us? And he promised to bring 2 million extra tourists into the country. And he actually divided it among the different airports, so that there'd be support for the initiative in the different regions. And he delivered, and we delivered. Now, it cost the Exchequer 38 million, but it was the best investment we ever made. And of course we had to, you know. And am I running out of time? No.
Not at all.
So in farming, we have a very big farming industry, very big in dairy product. And it's not just milk and cheese anymore. I mean, we're the main supplier of premium baby food into the Chinese market. And there's a factory in my constituency, Nestle are the latest owners of it. And after their purchasing, people came from China, and they bought the whole annual production of the factory of baby food. And it's milk in the fields around the factory. That's the raw material, and they produce baby food and they export it to China. But I brought in an awful lot of tax breaks for farming. And it wasn't for tax breaks for the products. The flaw we had in farming was that during the Celtic Tiger years, a lot of the young farming sons and daughters, but especially the sons, went into the building industry where they could make a lot of money in construction. And our cohort of farmers were elderly. They were in their 60s and 70s. So I brought in a whole lot of tax initiatives to make it easier for families to transfer farmland to the next generation of farmers, and to ensure that the next generation of farmers saw a future in farming. And that worked as well. We had a problem with building and construction. because it had been one of the causes of the crisis was the overcooking of the building and construction industry. And then it got a bad name and it became a scapegoat sector. So it was politically very difficult to do anything for it. But we cut stamp duty, which applied from 7% to 2% and to 1% for residential. And slowly it began to lift again. And we got another sector back. So what I'm suggesting as a formula is that because an IMF program by its nature takes demand out of the economy, you need a parallel set of strategies to get your economy growing, because the program itself will give you growth, but not for about 4 years. While you're going through it, it won't give you the growth element. After it's successful, the dividends come in. But you have to keep everybody happy in the meantime, and that's quite difficult. So parallel strategies for growth, and spoken to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet about this yesterday, and she understands exactly what we're talking about, and I don't think she disagrees in any way. The final thing I'd say is programs have to be short, because the patience of the electorate doesn't last. And what looks like a great idea, and what everybody says, oh yeah, great government, tough action, that's what we need. When the tough action begins to bite, at the end of year 2 and in year 3, people say, this crowd of wasters are no good. And then you don't have the popular support to complete your programs. And if you do what Greece did and let it drift on for 9 or 10 years, you're dead in the water. You have to say, we're in this and we're going to get out of this. And the Prime Minister will say, I'll have you out of this by the end of year 3. Now, Enda Kenny said that, and we went out at the end of year 3. Now, what getting out of the program means was that, we got back in a position where we could borrow on the markets for less than the cost of the money we were getting from the IMF and the Europeans. And it's not mysterious. Getting out of a program means you can borrow in the market and you can pay your way. It's like it's like when you were kids and you were bold and your pocket money was stopped. And someone took away your purse. It's like getting your purse back so that you can spend again on your own decisions. And that's what exiting the program means. And we exited the program without the IMF or Europe putting any conditions on us. Sometimes when you go out of a program, there's advice that you have to have some kind of transition program, and you have to have some kind of safety net, and you're kind of half in and half out. My advice is, if you get out at the right time, make it clear cut, and we're out. Because being out boosts confidence and boosts morale, whereas being half out does nothing. People are waiting for you to go back in again. So my third piece of advice is have the program of a short duration. And as social partners, I think, if you have a definite deadline on the termination date of the program, you'll find it much easier when you're talking to your members that you represent. If you're saying, yeah, it's tough, but we're doing this because we all need to rescue this country, and we're doing this for ourselves and for our families, and it's going to work, but it's not indefinite. We're going to be out of it in 3 years' time, or 2 years' time, or whatever the timeline is. So we'll take questions. Now, we're not business consultants or financial consultants. Our only claim to fame is that we went through it and we emerged successfully, and we have the fastest growing economy in Europe now, and we have more people at work now than we've ever had since the state was founded in 1922. We're growing at about 4.5%. We're putting on around 60,000 jobs every week, and Ireland is a major location now for foreign direct investment. Every big name in digital, every big name in pharma have their European headquarters now in Ireland, not only in Dublin but throughout the country as well. So there's a huge reward for success, and it's well worth being committed and planning it, seeing it through. And I know that, you know, you're like ourselves. You don't sign in blindly because you have members to represent. So you have to have a say as well. And I know the Prime Minister is very open to you having your say and taking your advice and correcting any mistakes that you might see and accentuating any positives that you see as well. So thank you, Prime Minister. It's great to be here, and I wish you every success.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Let me just add, if I may, Prime Minister, to what Ms. Noonan said. As I said in the beginning, I'm 44 years in national politics. I know what the people say about politicians, that you can't trust them, that they're only in it for themselves, and that it's all about, as we say in Ireland, me fain, me. I am the most important person in the entire planet. My view of politics from a very young age was that it's never about yourself. If you believe in the job, it's about the people. So when I was elected as Prime Minister, we cut the salaries of the ministers, starting with myself. Every minister in the Irish government had a car from the state. We took those away and made them buy their own cars. They had state drivers who were policemen. We took those away and put those policemen out on the beat on the streets and allowed people to hire their own civilian drivers. I did not stay in the official residence of the Prime Minister. I walked to work every day so that the busmen and the taximen and the people on the street who were giving out in the beginning began to say, these people are serious. I say that in the context of a government wanting to show people that they actually did understand. But we also had to deal with the European context because we were one of 28 countries. And that meant building a new sense of relations there, because given the state of our economy, we were in what we called the pigs arena. That was Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. And we were the first to exit that quartet. Now, what I'm going to say to you is really important about politics, because people in Ireland felt that their sovereignty was taken away when the Troika or the IMF bailout commenced. In other words, the government were not in charge of what was happening. And on the day that Minister Noonan rang me, and he said, in December 2013, we are going to be able to exit this program. And we're going to be able to exit it without conditions and without having to go into a second program. I just want you to understand this, that evening on the streets in Dublin, you could see the pride in people's eyes that their country was back on the stage where it could make its own decisions for its own people, having restored its integrity and its reputation and its capacity to be able to enter the international markets and borrow money in the national interest. I think that that's a really important element of believing in democracy and believing in a program. And let me just reiterate again for you what the Minister said and what your Prime Minister is doing. You have to take the rough with the smooth here. It was another American president who said, do what you can with what you have where you are. So we got assistance from other countries. Britain was the first to come out with a loan for Ireland and said, there's 8 or 9 billion for you. Other countries did. We've paid all those back. So we give the credit not to government, but to the people, the social partnership, who accepted that there was a really difficult job to be done here. And instead of sweeping it under the carpet, deal with it.
Thank you. I think that even before you ask a question, you appreciate why this encounter is absolutely important, and why I say to you that if Enda was not leaving this afternoon, I'd have to make room for him locally. The floor is now open for commentary and questions. Thank you. 'Cause just identify who you are, and not only by name but by representation, so that the gentleman will have context. Thank you.
President of the Congress of Trade Unions and Staff Associations. By the way, Mr. Kenny, the Irish also came to Barbados as teachers and priests and soldiers, and in a bit of social engineering to ensure that there was a certain ratio between the races, just for your further education. Now, we are all aware of the troubles of the 70s and 60s, which I would categorize as a political response, even though it had some criminal consequences. What was the effect of the IMF program what criminal factors emerged, if any, during the IMF program that were not the political troubles for which Ireland was well known?
I'm not sure that what factor.
Were there any criminal consequences or effects?
Was there an increase in crime? Is what you mean?
No. It's possible that there may have been a decrease, but yes.
Right. Were there any social consequences or increases in crime as a result of an IMF program? Does that capture it?
Michael, do you want to take
Michael?
The short answer is no, there weren't. The main effects of the program was living standards went down, and it took a while to get people back to work again. I mean, in the building industry collapsed. 250,000 men became redundant. Quite a number of those had come in from Eastern Europe during boom times, and they just went home. Or some of them went to the UK where there was still some building activity. And in Ireland, they went on the dole. Now, one of the things we did is we refused to cut basic social welfare payments. So we had a safety net for stability at that level. But it was tough. But people didn't go into crime. And I'd say if you look at the statistics, because there was so much immigration of young people, there was probably less crime during the crisis than there was before. But there was no cross-pollination between the political troubles in Northern Ireland and the rescue of the country economically. They were in two distinct baskets, and there was no crossover between them. The only elements that were there is that we put together a kind of bad bank, which is called NAMA, and that bought up the assets of the banks, which were bad debts in effect. And the security for a lot of those bad debts was property. And some of that property was in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland and investors in Northern Ireland, some of them were affected by our crisis. But we just worked our way through that. But it was investors losing money. But then it was because they made bad investments.
You see, what was happening was, when Michael said that 250,000 people were made redundant and you had mass emigration, that meant that, let's say, somebody had a reasonably good job, they'd taken a mortgage from a bank, they'd built their house for their wives and families, whatever, and suddenly the job was gone and the mortgage couldn't be repaid. And there were hundreds of thousands of these. So when the letters were coming from the bank in the door, they weren't opened, and they weren't answered, so it got worse. And this began to pile up, and people were under extreme pressure, mentally, physically, with their families. What am I to do? We have no income, we've got no money, we can't meet these repayments. So all your workforce in the construction sector was gone, the building firms had collapsed, the banks were out of business. Minister Noonan set up the National Asset Management Agency. It had an 80 billion euro bad loan portfolio. And that was down on the backs of the workers. So social partnership in that context was able to understand that their members were many of the people who were not able to meet mortgage repayments. Their members were people who had emigrated to get work wherever and send back money to keep things going with the family. It was a really difficult time in a modern country. The banks went over the edge, and we had to bear the brunt of that ourselves. Minister Noonan was in Brussels on numerous occasions. Was there myself at European Council meetings until 4 o'clock in the morning. And you had to say to your colleagues, look, we know we're in trouble, but we want to get out of this and we need your assistance. And if you don't want to give us assistance, please give us understanding. Because we've fought wars in countries for centuries, and now we have to fight our own economic war to get out of it. And that's what we did.
Thank you. I think that one of the things that came out yesterday, and perhaps this would give you more context, Edwin, is that even though there may not have been a stark increase in crime, there were difficulties socially, there were additional suicides,
Yeah.
there were all kinds of increases in mental health breakdown. So all of these things are in fact consequential upon people not being able to meet the difficulties confronting them from no money, no property, etc. And then of course when people emigrate and leave families behind, you have the risk of families breaking up because people get lonely where they go and where they stay. So there are all kinds of social consequences, and the moral of the story is let us get in and out as quickly as possible. And when people ask us why we've been pressing as hard as we do, or why we are holding to the things that we agreed to, like overtime can't be a core cost of adjustment or competitiveness, it is because if you try to cut with a dull knife, you risk getting gangrene.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Thank Mr. Isdell for his love of Barbados and for bringing these gentlemen here, and thank them for their sort of presentation in a lovely Irish lilt. Just a couple of comments and then a question. First of all, I think, notwithstanding that we are in the IMF, I think conversations I'm having, you see the confidence that has returned, because I think of the steps that the present government has taken and the Prime Minister has led. And clearly, I think one of the differences between Barbados and Ireland, and you mentioned, moving very early to, recognizing what was happening. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister is being given, as we were saying, cricket parlance, the ball at the very last stages of the over to really do what needs to be done. And so I think that makes it even more challenging for us. But I'm confident that we're on the right track. And one of the signs of that really is that what was a dormant social partnership, I know from the first day the Prime Minister's re-engaged this group in and has kept us fully abreast of all that has been going on. I think though in bad times, obviously when you have cuts, when you return to good health, and that this is true of anyone who is also, from a personal and health point of view, they say, oh, well, I'm good again, and bad habits start to creep in. And again, the PM has said, there are steps being taken in terms of fiscal and monetary policy to prevent that. But one of the questions I have really is that in terms of the cuts in state-owned enterprises or, the state sort of budget, were those fundamental, long-lasting, what measures have been put in place to really balance what the economy can sustain from taxation and support in the state and what the private sector can, and basically the working population can support? Because I think we did end up with a bloated government and state-owned enterprise situation because we were in good health. And we would not want to have that situation return when we do return to good health. I think we're all confident we will get back there. So I just wonder what Ireland has done to make sure that, when, or as your economy now has come back to good health, that you're not going to sort of go back to bad habits. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
this is obviously a central question. Michael will deal with the measures of tax changes that he brought in. But in respect of the sort of parallel program that we put in place for Ireland as distinct from the taking ownership of the IMF program, we set out a broad ambition, much like what your own Prime Minister has said here in respect of Barbados. Our thing was, to be seen as the best small country in the world in which to do business, be seen as the best country in which to raise a family. This family is very important in Ireland, no more than here. And then to be the best country in which to grow old with a sense of dignity and respect. So we set out to say, okay, we're going to create 100,000 new jobs. These jobs are going to be at a level of remuneration upon which income tax can be paid, which will be ploughed into services for the people. In other words, if you like, the political requirement was to change the mood of the nation from one of being disillusionment and despair to one of confidence and optimism. Now, if you went to our country in the 50s or the 60s, you'd have found a country that was entirely Irish, or practically entirely Irish, that was introverted and protectionist, that had a very antiquated and traditional agri-system. But our involvement with the European Union opened our country to the world. If you go into a secondary school today, or a primary school, go into any class, in any of the cities, you might find 20 different nationalities in there. It could be, the implications are for the teaching profession, let's say in religion, you might have people who are of the Muslim faith or the Christian faith, or they might be agnostic, or they might be anything. So these require changes in the way that you teach and the issues that you address for children. So if I were to see anything that has changed because of the influence of the European Union, it is the confidence of people. And I would say to the people of responsibility here in Barbados, down in front of me, and the Prime Minister knows this, the education system is the key to the future, because the future is where we all have to live. And if you get your focus in the education business right, the young children who are at school today in Barbados will be inspired to understand that they have a future here, or that they can be whoever they want to be, and that they can do within the limits of the law whatever it is that their dream is. And in that sense, we changed obviously the enterprises. We kept the agency that deals with bringing people into Ireland with foreign direct investment is called the Industrial Development Authority. They're very good. We called them all back to Ireland. We called back all the ambassadors. We said, I want you to understand that this government is going to fix this with the people. And I want you to understand that in your diplomatic relations with other countries, trade is going to be critical. And we appointed people second in command in those embassies and consular offices whose remit was trade. We actually gave business people from Ireland who were traveling to Australia or to America or wherever, we gave them a synopsis of the improving state of the economy, which came out from Michael Noonan's office, so that when they were talking to their peers or their counterparts in South Africa or wherever it was, or America, they were able to say, oh, by the way, here's the situation in Ireland. They're making their way out of practically junk status to be able to dip their toe again in the markets. And for micro enterprises at home, small businesses employing 5, 10, 20 people doing different kinds of jobs, we set up an organization at every local authority level called the local enterprise offices. And these offered assistance and guidance for business plans and where you might find markets and how to sell things for the ideas and the products that they were making. To sustain those jobs, because the 5s and the 10s and the 20s were really critical to a small country with rural areas like Ireland's. So we focused on those agencies, and at the higher level of the public service, in the negotiations that took place about pay and conditions, we actually got a very substantial amount of hours extra worked by public servants for which they were not paid. In other words, they were giving extra time in the national interest, if you like. So all of that was going on across a whole range of areas. Sometimes very hard to see the results immediately, but it was also an engagement with the people and therefore their understanding and their involvement in what was a national response to a national calamity. Michael, you might deal with some of the taxation measures that you brought in to sort of stimulate that, which I think can be paralleled in many ways by what the Prime Minister is doing here in Barbados.
If Ireland was a small shop or a small restaurant, and you looked at the balance sheet, the opening difficulty was that you were spending an awful lot more than you were earning. So there was a huge gap between money coming into the exchequer and money going out. So the project then was to close that gap. And it was filled on a temporary basis by money from the IMF and money from Europe. But that wasn't sustainable. So we had to close the gap. So we closed it by increasing taxes and by cutting expenditure. And we increased personal taxation, principally income tax. We increased VAT by a couple of points. We increased excise across the board on drink, alcohol, tobacco, fossil fuels, so on. The only thing we didn't touch was the 12.5% corporate tax rate that we have on the profits of the companies that invest, because we wanted to stay competitive and to continue to attract in the foreign direct investment, which provides a lot of the new employment in the new industries for our young people. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The second area of adjustment then was cutting expenditure. And Enda divided the Department of Finance into my side of it, which was effectively the finance role and the policy role, but there was a public expenditure section as well, which dealt with wages across the public service. And we set ceilings on expenditure for all departments, as one normally would, but there were less than there were the previous year, and there were less again the following year. And the big adjustment there then was the cut in the public sector pay bill, which was between 15 and 20%. Now, in doing this, we tried to protect the low pay. We tried to protect the unemployed by not touching the basic rates of social welfare. And we tried to, as far as possible, impose the taxes on those that could afford to pay. But if you were talking to them, they wouldn't say that that was the situation, because it was quite difficult, and there's no doubt about that. But the big adjustment then came when our parallel growth strategy began to kick in after year 2, and the economy began to grow rapidly. The extra growth in the economy gave us the buoyancy of taxation, and then the gap closed very quickly without we taking any further action. So we're at the stage now where our budgets are in surplus, and there's what we call a rainy day fund into which the surplus is being paid, so that we have a fund which can be deployed if there's another crisis down the road. And like yourselves, we're a very open economy, very small, and our future isn't always in our own hands. We depend a lot on the ebb and flow of international events. So we do need protection for the downswing, which we didn't have in the past. And the final point I'd make is back to what Enda was saying about education and what you were saying yourselves. The courses in the universities and in the technical colleges are courses to skill young people for the new economy, not for the old economy. And if you don't have a new economy on your island, then there's nothing as mobile as smart young people. They're gone like that. And there's a lot of people all around the world who will put any price on attracting very skilled, educated young people. So you have the problem we had. You have to build your modern economy as well, not only for economic reasons, but for social reasons, to keep your smart young people at home. And I know you have a problem, as we had, with the migration of the young. And you know, we've looked at it, and it's simple enough. If they marry one of their own nationality, they tend to come back after having the first child. If they marry somebody abroad, they tend to stay away.
Thank you. And perhaps I would only add to that, that in our history, like Ireland, we have had people for decades emigrating, and it was only between the late 1970s and about 5-6 years ago that Barbadian young people chose to come back here as a matter of choice. We've started to lose it because of that lost decade, and it is for us to regain it now by doing, as you said, creating the opportunities for young people and creating the platform that we'll talk about more at the end.
Hi, good morning. Tricia Tanis, Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I just want to congratulate certainly the government for convening this forum, which indeed is tremendous in terms of its value add. And I do concur with the earlier sentiments of the Prime Minister. This certainly is one of the most, I believe, grassroots conversations that I think we've been treated to. And I congratulate the Prime Minister on the forum. We heard a lot so far as to what worked. And my question simply is, we would like to learn from your missteps as well, so that we can also be very well positioned to know what to do and what not to do. So my question simply is, what did not work? If you had something that you would prefer not to have done again, what would that be?
I suppose our biggest failure early on was not being able to convince the IMF or the European Central Bank that we needed debt write-downs on the banks. Our banks were private sector banks, and it ended up with the Irish taxpayer picking up the bill for private sector banks that were in bust. Now, the banks didn't walk away free. Shareholder values were eliminated completely. So shareholders lost everything they had, and subordinate bondholders, they got a very severe haircut. But principal bondholders, on the insistence of the European Central Bank and the IMF, were paid in full. And I mean, it's a risk business if you invest. And they got an extra interest rate because they were taking a risk. And then when the time came, they said, "Oh no, we want all our money back." And they were backed by the IMF and by the European Central Bank on the principle that if there was a severe haircut on principal bondholders, it would threaten the banking system and kick on. And we had people as eminent as Tim Geithner advising not to give a haircut to the Irish exchequer on the banks. Now we got around it, like, you know, the way it is, if you take ownership of your program and you establish good relationships with everybody who's on the other side of the table. And we invented a kind of a novel way of monetizing some of the debt through the central bank, and it worked out okay in the end. But early on, that was a big failure. And because it was self-evidently unjust that the taxpayer would have to pay for the liabilities incurred by a bank in which they had no ownership at all, then that was a blow to the program, and it made it more difficult for us to continue with the support of the people. That was a big problem. I suppose the second problem was something that we did very effectively, but there was elements of it which didn't work out. We had a big problem with water, like you have here. And the local authorities were responsible for delivering water supply. And we have, 42 local authorities in the country. And Enda will tell you about this as well because he's more expert on it than I am. But we decided to put a national water board in place, Irish Water, and that this would be responsible for all the infrastructure and do the repairs on the pipes and make sure there was supply all over the country. And we always had commercial charges on water, which, you know, were flat first and then metered. But we decided to put a charge on households, and there was huge resistance and protest in the streets. And after a long drawn-out series of protests, we had to back off on that. And, you know, I would say that we didn't handle that very well. But then we didn't expect the opposition either to it. That was a failure as well. Otherwise, most of what we did worked out, and worked out against a fairly tight timeline. And
we had one other, which was we have a two-tier health system in Ireland. Michael's dealt now with the two what were serious political issues. So in Ireland, you have a public health system and you have a private health system. Essentially, you pay your private health insurance to be able to get attention more quickly in hospitals from the same consultants who are also doing the work in the public sector. And what we had intended to do was to introduce universal health care, a one system for everybody. And we went over to Holland to look at what they do over there in the Netherlands. But this didn't work out. It was exceptionally costly, and health systems, as you know, in any country are always difficult because they're very personal. Families, people waiting on waiting lists for operations, people who unfortunately don't live to have the operation, whatever it might be. So we have lots of backlogs in the system waiting for particular operations. It could be psoriasis, it could be the orthopedic operations or cancer operations, and we've had a number of difficulties in that area. So what we had intended to do was to introduce a single universal healthcare system, and we didn't. If you were to design a health system for a country like Ireland now, you'd probably design it in a very different way than what has evolved over the years. It's a country of small towns, a few large cities, and many rural areas. So you have, difficulties in getting people from a place where they become ill or have a sudden illness to hospital within the first hour and a half. That's improving with helicopter access and better road systems and all of that. But health generally is a problem, not just in Ireland, but other well-developed countries like Britain or Canada have serious challenges in the health area as well. But then in politics, you're never going to get everything right. It's not a perfect system. You always run the risk as Prime Minister and members of government of being challenged, and rightly so, in respect of the work that you do. But I think if you're clear in your conscience that what you believe is right for the people and for the country, then you won't go too far wrong. As somebody, one of my predecessors said one time, you never need legislation to know the difference between right and wrong.
Well said.
Actually, just a final comment on that. When a program is successful, that doesn't mean you have any more. You don't have problems. And like in Ireland now, our problems are the problems of success, not the problems of failure. There are so many people working, it's hard to provide rental accommodation in the cities, and rents have gone up. We have a supply problem in housing now. Even though we'll build 25,000 houses this year, it's just not enough. And although prices of houses are stabilized now, there's still a problem. There's still a big problem. So, the health services even, when you think about health, it's the only industry, if I can call it that, where the whole population are potential customers. Like everything else, it's a section or a sector. But anybody can get sick anytime. So your full population, and of course our population has gone up since we fixed our economy. And we've got a lot of people coming in from Europe again now to work in Ireland. And every one of them is a potential user of the health services. So that has put health under tremendous pressure. So, you know, when you're bringing your people with you, don't present it as we can cure this for all time and you'll never have a problem again. Because as your economy begins to grow, you'll have the problems of economic success rather than the problems of economic failure.
Thank you. It's called Growing Pains.
Good morning. Tony Moore from the Congress of the Barbados Workers' Union, the largest on the island. I am very happy to be here this morning to hear the presentation that has been made, the discussion, to follow the discussion so far. For indeed, I've been one that have been following the Irish model of social partnership, its successes and failures, the rise and fall of it. And so I have been very intrigued with your efforts as Prime Minister, Mr. Kenny, to bring it back on track. You started off by saying that it is very much about trust, your opening statements. And so I'm sure you would be aware that we went through a period where the social partnership pretty much didn't function in Barbados. So amongst everything else, this government had to restore some measure of trust. If we were to anticipate that we could be as successful as Ireland in using the social partnership as a means through a crisis, and if we can anticipate that we might even be where you were in 3-4 years, then it would be fair to say that we've pretty much completed a 10K, but the marathon has yet to be completed. How do we sustain the energy and the enthusiasm of partners to commit to the effort? How do we ensure, drawn from your experiences, how did you ensure that accountability and trust was maintained throughout all levels of your government? And when I say throughout all levels of your government, I don't only mean at the ministerial level, but across all levels of government, the people who have to execute and make things happen. Because I heard you speak about every quarter ministers responsible for certain areas of strategy would have to give account. But how did you ensure that in the rollout, that things happened as agreed at the higher level of the social partnership? And then I was also interested in what the Minister of Finance, former Minister of Finance, was saying about the new economy. How do we go about working towards building that new economy, establishing that new economy? In Barbados right now, people are of the view that a number of the economic targets have been met, but that we are lagging behind in the social targets. How do we ensure, how did you go about ensuring that your young people could be inspired to feel that they can be a part of a future in Ireland? Because I think that answers to that question in particular, what a number of young workers would be interested in, if we can draw from your experience, and a number of young students as well. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Social partnership didn't function in Ireland for a long period either. Governments ignored trade unions on many occasions for many years with serious consequences. I think social partnership is what it means, and it's a sort of cooperative groupings towards common objectives in the sense of the well-being of the country. And you know, from a government point of view, governments are different in every country, and the personality of whoever leads them is a critical element of where the focus and the objective is. Shortly after I was elected, I went to America, and they said, "What has happened to your country? Your integrity is in shreds and your reputation is in tatters." And I said, what would you do? He said, well, show them you're serious. So are you serious? So when you set out a government program and a strategy, are you realistic about this? Have you defined it to a point where you can actually achieve it? You can't do this. The Prime Minister, no matter what she does, she needs the assistance and understanding of what teamwork is about. And that's not just from government, but it's from the public service and the social partnership. Now, I know myself. Take any department of government. You're going to find some really bright sparks in there who, like, they're anxious to get on with it and they understand their role and their responsibility and they do superb work. Others don't measure up to that level. But what I found, if you had a range of problems across different departments, that you need the public service to be able to deliver on them. I set up a system of having cabinet subcommittees, not formal meetings of the cabinet, but you might have 2 or 3 ministers there, depending on the issue that was to be dealt with. And that you would say to the public servants of senior rank, look, this has dragged on for 3 years. Now we must deal with it. I need to know what the options are so that we can make a decision, because government is essentially about making decisions. And I actually found that if you empower public servants, rather than have them just drifting through their job, that you say to them, okay, you're in charge of this now, and I want you back here in a month. I want this thing examined. I want to know the options that we have to consider before we make a decision. But I am empowering you with your permanent secretary to work with the minister, and if you have a problem, come back here to me. I found genuinely that they went out that door with a whole new impression of their career and what their responsibility is. Some people do that much better than others. And we have a public service that some people go out of their way to do extraordinary work, and sometimes that doesn't happen in all cases. But the answer to your question is that if you empower public servants with responsibility, rather than just blandly saying, I am working in the department of X and Y, but what are you doing in X and Y? And what is your minister going to do when he or she has a quarterly report on the progress they're making with their department in the context of the strategy of government overall? Because Prime Minister's got to answer for that, and the people are the masters at the end of the day. So change is always the issue. How do you invigorate them? How do you keep them tuned up, as it were? Well, I remember Microsoft did a presentation one day for me, and in the course of that they had 2 photographs which shows you the way things have moved and how the change is always evolving as it is now. And the 2 photographs were taken in the same spot, 15 years apart. And the pictures were taken at the Flatiron Building on Broadway in New York. And the first picture was taken in 1910, and the streets were filled with horses, because 50% of the economy of New York was based around the horse for transporting goods. You had farriers and harness makers and wheelwrights and stable hands and the agriculture process to deal with all of that. The second picture was taken in 1925, 15 years later, and there were hardly any horses. All those thousands of jobs were gone, and they devolved into assembly line workers and spray painters and chemical mixers and invoice creators in the motor industry and whatever else. And now this is changing the frontiers again up ahead, because it's all being concentrated. So much information available to you instantly. I've been in houses in Ireland where the television is on in the corner and the family are all looking at things themselves. There's no talk going on anymore, no conversation. And the more tunes you have and the more fingers you have and the more thumbs up you have, the more friends you have, the more lonely people can be and the more isolated they can be. So on the one hand, we've got an intergalactic space, and now we're going into the nanostructure, and in houses around the world, there is silence. The human voice is not heard where it should be heard, and people don't engage the way they should. So at a government level, you have to keep changing, because the jobs are changing in front of our eyes. And if the young people are not inspired through the universities and the colleges of technology to understand that they're going to live in a very different world than their mammies and their daddies, what are they going to do? We called in people we said to them, tell us where you think the opportunities are going to be in the next 5 years. You can't really tell you, but they can guess. Artificial intelligence, quantum physics, robotics, data analytics, logistics, all these things. I said yesterday to the Prime Minister, the head of Cisco was talking recently about 20 billion hits on their system every day. 20 billion. You can only analyze that by massive capacity in logistics. But if there's something wrong in there, you have to find it. So that's all changing in front of Barbadians' eyes, the same as in front of Irish eyes. And if you don't give the young people the opportunity to say, I can change that, I'll deal with it because I'm thinking in a different sphere than you. And my children say to me, you don't understand how to work this thing at all. I can send an email or receive a phone call and that's about it. Well, these are in a different world. And I was pointing out yesterday to the Cabinet, 20 years ago, people who are in the software business in Ireland said, okay, every Saturday we'll give a few hours free of charge at no cost to the children of this locality to understand what code writing is. And we called that Coder Dojo. And it began a movement around Ireland which spread internationally. We have a whole generation of young people who understand that language and the new languages of coding that I never heard of, and I wouldn't understand anything about it. But they can say to you, this will make the car go around the track and faster, and it'll pick this and pick that. These are the ways of the future. So, are we going to lose all these jobs? Well, I read a report from mining in Sweden recently, and the man who was in an office watching 12 television sets, he said, I have a new job. This job was never here before, because I'm watching machines that are 2 miles down, mining, and if it collapses itself, nobody dies. He said, this job was never here before. So all these things that are happening on an unprecedented scale are opportunities in their own way for young Barbadians. And if you get that right, which I'm sure you will, Prime Minister, and if you people stick with the government on this, you're going to create a great future for all your people.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathy Ann Hewitt, Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados. I just had one quick question. You had indicated that one of the areas that you looked at with cost cutting was reallocating, for example, policemen who were drivers, and then ministers would have to have their private drivers. I was just wondering, in terms of those changes, were those permanent, or did things go back to this previous structure?
Permanent. In fact, what they did was, they used to have a system in Ireland that whoever the Prime Minister was had a car for life. So if you only served a day as the Prime Minister, you'd have a car and drivers for life. I took that away. And one of my predecessors of my own party was a wonderful man. He was 90 years of age. And I said to him, Mr. Cosgrave, we will leave the car with you. And he said, no, you won't. I'll do my driving test, which he did. Permanent. In other words, if you're going to do it, prove it, and let them see it.
Thank you. Now you know why I don't live in the official residence.
Good morning, everyone. Akani McDowell, National Union of Public Workers, President. A quick question from me as well. I found interesting that you mentioned that the private sector would have made a significant sacrifice during those difficult times, between 15 to 20% cut, I think you said that they took. So my question is, the public sector, I said the private? Oh, sorry. Public sector. So my simple question is, when you came out of those difficult times, were there additional benefits that were given to the public sector, and what were those benefits, if any?
It's an ongoing story, and there have been a series of negotiations through the social partners and directly to the public sector unions to restore what was taken away. And the full restoration on pay will not be complete until the end of 2022. But there's about 5% outstanding. Now, there's slight variations between different groups across the public service. bigger variations for senior civil servants, because they'd be really the last group to get restoration of pay.
Hello, good morning. Donna Wellington, Barbados Bankers Association. You mentioned a lot of trauma really in the banking sector, and I was wondering what safeguards, if any. We had different issues in the banking sector, and thankfully here in Barbados, not the sort of issues that were had in Ireland, but I'm wondering what safeguards, if any, were put on the banking sector to make sure that the challenges that were faced with the mortgage crisis, etc., were not repeated.
Yeah, the banking sector problems are worldwide and certainly European-wide. So a whole lot of legislation has been introduced at European level. There's banking union now in Europe, where the same rules apply to all banks, high street banks operating across the European Union. And there's a regulatory office in Frankfurt now, which is parallel to, but not subsidiary to, the European Central Bank. It's a kind of a regulatory arm of the European banking system now, and that's separate. Within the country itself, we changed the legislation underpinning the work of the Central Bank, and the Central Bank, of course, is independent in Ireland, and on the mortgage side, the Central Bank has brought out pretty strict lending rules now to ensure that loans are made to those who have the capacity to repay, and is to avoid another run at a bubble economy on property and so on. So yeah, an awful lot of measures have been taken, and they seem to be working. You know, very often something works in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. But the theory here was put into law, and the primary elements are right across the European Union. And then there's a second level that apply to the Eurozone because of the 28 European countries in the Union. About 21 of them are in the common currency. So there's another set of stricter rules protecting the currency. And then the local central banks then, and our central bank in Dublin, is independent of government in the exercise of its function. It's independent under law. And they have brought in a series of regulations around lending, which protects the economy and so on.
Good morning. I'm Simone Rader. I'm Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. Thanking Prime Minister Mottley and former Prime Minister Kenny for this opportunity. I wanted to ask what was the role, or some examples of the role that your diaspora had in your Renaissance exercise. You have currently an excellent paper on engagement with the diaspora, so I know that would have grown from that experience. And then if there's time, we've had some talk about public sector and the role that public sector had to play in the change. You spoke about empowering public sector officials, but I would really like to hear some more about the reform measures that were specifically taken by the government for this. But first the diaspora, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Diaspora is a critical element of who we are as Irish people. Obviously, they've spread all over the world for a variety of reasons. So with modern communications, Irish diaspora in Oregon or in Auckland or in San Diego or down in South America are all tuned in to their local radio stations where they came from and to the news from Ireland generally. I found myself in many places that you would go around the world formally as Prime Minister, that you'd meet people from your own county and they would actually know more about what was happening than you did yourself because they were tuned into the radio station. So diaspora, the call of home is very strong. The call of home is very strong. So when the recession hit and Minister Noonan was dealing with the consequences of it, where emigration took place, they went, to wherever people were, as happened in the centuries before. So, for instance, we called back something like 500 of the top Irish business people around the world. Call them back to Dublin to a series of conferences and say, look, you've done very well where you now are in whatever business that you're in. 7 out of every 10 aircraft in the sky are leased out of Ireland. 7 out of 10. So you brought back business people in whatever, technology, software, whatever. And they gave their stories, but they also gave objective opinion on how you should move the country forward given its difficulties. And that was an important series of statements from well-known, influential and proven people, kind of to say to young people, look, you can do this too if you wish. As well as that, in a hospitality and tourism context, we had a gathering which I know you've considered here. We invited people from all over the world who were Irish to come back to wherever they came from or their ancestors came from. We called it the gathering. And for relatively little money, you set out a strategy whereby communities came together, would welcome back during the month of July or August or whenever, either community events or families that came back themselves, sometimes in quite large numbers, to an area. It not only did it bring a new spend into many of the more rural areas, but it also created a whole new series of contacts for younger people to meet with their long-lost cousins that they'd never seen before or whatever like that. So our diaspora is a case in point. And when ministers were on duty on St. Patrick's Week, for instance, all around the world, it was part of their program that they would meet the Irish community in Beijing or in Christchurch or in San Diego or wherever and discuss the improvements in the country and take on board sort of ideas or opinions that they might have in that sense. So the diaspora was a critical element and still is. We find that you got 50,000 in America, we reckon, without any formal documentation. Many of them are married and have families, pay their social security, but they can't go home. Because if mommy dies or daddy dies, they won't be able to come back. So you find in hospitals in Ireland, they now have television sets where they can talk from the hospital to the people who might be affected, or indeed, as the case might be, oftentimes a funeral mass is televised to that family, wherever they might be around the world, because they can't come back from America if they're undocumented. And my case to President Trump a couple of years back was to legitimize that facility and take them out of the shadows and allow them to play their full part in a country in which they want to live. So diaspora is very important for us, and I think through the universities and colleges of technology, we've built on that. The Erasmus program for young Irish people, you can go to any country in Europe, to universities, get a greater, broader experience, and we find that Irish diaspora coming back from companies all over the world with experience add greatly to the dimension of the reputation of the country. Michael Noonan made the point yesterday that American firms would have $1 trillion in assets in Ireland now, and the vast majority of managers in those plants are Irish, trained abroad and gained experience. If you go to the Intel plant just outside Dublin and you walk around it, it's 10 kilometres. It's a massive plant. That's one of many massive plants. And they're there not just because of a tax issue, where our corporation tax rate is 12.5 across the board in every sector. It is because of that talent pool. And that talent pool is no different in Barbados if you get it excited and inspired to kind of change the ways of the future. Michael, do you want to
Can I do something? And
sorry.
I wasn't asked to speak at all. It was, in fact, I played my part. But I feel that I need to give a personal story which actually answers that question, I think, pretty strongly. And that is that I watched very closely as someone born in Ireland, but who left at the age of 10 to be brought up in Africa. My parents moved. But there's an Irish connection that continues very strongly around the world. The diaspora is really connected. And when the crisis hit and the new government came in 2011 under Enda, I watched the difficulties that we're having, and I went over and I had a look, and I thought, is there time to invest in Ireland now? And in 2013, I'd built enough trust in the turnaround of what was happening in Ireland to go and buy a 200,000 square feet centre. And that's just one little personal example. And my ability actually to do this is part of what I've been able to gain by doing that. I brought back into Ireland my stepbrother from the United States, who'd left and graduated from Trinity College in engineering honors. And of his class of that year, there were 13 who were in that class. 12 of them left Ireland within 1 year, and the other one got a job with Guinness. He's now back in Ireland with his family. So there is this connectivity, but it only happens when you make the decision that I think this is for real, I trust what's happening, and I will make the investment. Let me go now to Barbados. I've just made an investment in buying some properties in Barbados, which I'm going to renovate. And the Prime Minister announced that a few months ago. Why did I do that? Exactly the same reason as my investment in Ireland. I believed that now Barbados was going to replicate in its own way Ireland, and I had trust in the government, and I've invested money into Barbados as a result. I hope that answers your question.
Let me give you context, because Neville is as modest as he can possibly be. The investment which he made in Ireland, if you go on your phones and you look for EPIC, you will see an amazing museum, Neville, to Irish heritage and development.
It's called the Irish Emigration Museum, and it talks about the people that left Ireland and succeeded.
And could he please tell you what they recently won?
I was just in Madeira 3 weeks ago and collected an award from the World Trade
Tourism
Award, World Tourism Award, and EPIC was awarded the leading tourist attraction in Europe. It's 3 years old.
And could you ask him now to tell you where he has bought in Barbados?
Rather near the screw dock.
He's bought the waterfront properties on the Corinage, and the investment which is going to be made there will be significant to the turnaround of Bridgetown, and it is because he's had confidence in the direction in which we're going. So we have our part to play now.
I had the opportunity of opening the EPIC in Dublin, and it's a wonderful facility. Yeah. It's all digital, and it's a living past. That's what it is. It's a living past. You can find out who they were, when they left, where they left from, their stories of the past related to the present, and look to the future.
And not only is the DNA the heritage possibilities there, I think the part that I love is the dancing, which is done in an electronic manner. And you have to see it to see how engaging the museum is and interactive it is. It's absolutely phenomenal. And I have not visited it, because I haven't visited Ireland. I've only watched it on the internet, so that should tell you the possibilities.
We'll get you there soon.
Ed?
Good morning, still good morning. Ed Clark, Chairman of the Barbados Private Sector Association. It really is a pleasure to hear some Beijing coming from the Irish Prime Minister, former Irish Prime Minister this morning. When we travel to places outside of Barbados, sometimes people of the lighter complexion, I would say, they ask which part of Ireland are we from. So good to hear Beijing talking some Irish this morning.
I thought you were going to say and remind him, as we both know, that if we didn't have any recorded history of Irish immigration into Barbados, that there was one word that would cause us to know that we have elements of a common ancestry. We will repeat that one. Well,
I have two questions, really. It was interesting to hear that Mr. Noonan mentioned the challenge or the opportunity given to the tourism industry, because tourism in Ireland is a huge part of your economy. And you took a big risk by reducing the VAT in tourism and abolishing the travel tax. You know, in some cases we tend to try to tax the industries that are doing very well. But you took an opposite decision, a decision to do something opposite and reduce those taxes. So you're obviously taking a risk. And I'm very happy to hear that it paid off, it worked. Obviously, you must have had a plan. Well, what if this didn't work? What would I do next? But I think it teaches us a lesson too, because, you know, tourism is a low-hanging fruit. It is a very quick turnaround boost to the economy. And I am asking if that was essential in the drive towards growing the parallel sector. That's my first question. Was that the essential element that started the drive of growth?
We have, according to our Central Statistics Office, 14 sectors in the Irish economy. And 3 of them are public service sectors, and 11 are private sector. Mm-hmm. And tourism is one of the 11. Mm-hmm. And it had made itself, as a consequence of what had happened in the previous years, uncompetitive. It had priced itself out of the market, in effect. Now, there were still tourists coming in, but a lot of the hotels and guest houses and restaurants were no longer profitable. Mm-hmm. And when the economy crashed, restaurants were closing down every week because people couldn't afford to go there. And, you know, even people with money, when times are bad, pull back. They tend to reduce their spending, even if they have money to spend. So it was hit very hard. I wouldn't say it was the sector that stimulated every other sector. I would think it was the first one that we got growing strongly. And then that was followed very quickly by agriculture, particularly dairy production and increased production. And like the tourist industry, a lot of its hotspots are in the underdeveloped parts of the country, where the scenery is beautiful, but where the economic activity is low. So the tourist industry not only creates wealth, but it distributes it. And when you're trying to bring a whole community with you, the distribution of resources and wealth is as important as its creation. Like if everything was created in the Dublin area, then we wouldn't have been as successful as we were on the program. And on the farming side, you have farmers are great to spend. Farmers are, by their nature, they're always doing things on the farm. So if the farm income goes up a little bit, they'll start putting down farm roads and they'll put up new sheds and all that kind of stuff. So that does stimulate the countryside around, and it involves the small builders and so on. But by taking, I mean, it goes back to the point I made originally. I mean, I couldn't design the interventions for Barbados because I don't know the microeconomy well enough. But I'm advocating the principle that you look at your economy sector by sector and you ask a very simple question: what can I do to get this growing more than it's growing at present? And then do it, you know? Yeah. And you won't be successful all the time. But when an economy is in recession, even cutting a tax like travel tax from our point of view, because travel had reduced in the country anyway, the total take on travel was 38%, 38 million. That was the travel tax take. Now, it was petty cash compared to the difficulty we were in. So even if it didn't succeed, I wasn't actually taking a very big risk.
Right. Okay.
Could I ask one question? What was the tax on the VAT on tourism before you, was it the same as the rest of the country?
No, we have two VAT rates.
Right.
We have one at 21, it was, and subsequently we raised that to 23. That'll be across a series of consumer items. And the other one was 13 and a half. And there's a whole lot of activity there. Like building was at 13 and a half now. Building was at 13 and a half, but so was tourism.
Okay.
And we took some of the activities at 13 and a half and brought them down to 9. The principal one was tourism. The newspaper and print industry was also in trouble, so we brought that down to 9. Hairdressing for social reasons and I suppose gender reasons. I wouldn't be that expert on hairdressing.
Neither me.
Nor you.
Michael, deal with
but it was a very clever political decision.
Right.
Because you see, there are several hairdressers in every village in Ireland, and women go there in good times every week, and in bad times maybe on special occasions or once a month. But the conversation is great, and when the hairdresser says, well, there's €3 off your wash and set, and they say, where did that come from? The government, the new government did that, you know.
Michael, deal with
this was very good politics.
Michael, deal with the actual travel tax and what that meant. The travel tax actually did
the travel. What happened with the travel tax is there are two big carriers in Ireland: Aer Lingus, which used to be the national carrier, but it's now private, and Ryanair. And both of them bring a lot of people into the country and take a lot of people out. And Michael O'Leary, who's head of Ryanair, lobbied very hard for the abolition of the travel tax. And Enda would know him and I would know him. So we brought him in and we sat him down and we said, that's great. And if we did it, what would you do for us? So he said he'd bring in 2 million extra tourists. And he'd bring the majority of them into Dublin Airport, but he'd bring some to Shannon Airport as well, which is down my side of the country, and Knock Airport, which is up near Enda's constituency. And so we did it. So I said, look, we'll do it so, and we hope you deliver, and if you don't, I'll bring the travel tax back in the second next budget.
Right.
And the thing you should remember is this.
He delivered, and I delivered.
In this was as a temporary measure to stabilise an industry. And it did stabilise the tourism industry, but it also allowed it to create 35,000 new jobs. And I'll tell you what happened. Every restaurant you went into, after he reduced the level of VAT, they had a little notice on the table saying, your meal is being served this evening at a lower rate of VAT. This is of benefit to us, and we thank the government for so doing. But the second consequence was that the Irish actually began to understand, like every other place around the world, that what you have in local produce can be developed far more than it ever was. So some of our best chefs, nationally known figures, began to treat basic Irish food in a very different way. Right. And the food here in Barbados is wonderful food. We're the same actually now, because there's a new confidence about what you can do with basic raw materials. You don't have to have the stuff from around the world when you've got your own. It can be very different. And I think that was a new element of confidence among people. I can do a new dish, new taste, all that kind of thing. So one of the big groups, the Kerry group, came back from America, put 100 million into a place outside Dublin, and they develop tastes, they develop flavors, and they take basic ingredients of food, and they can do anything with them. So the move, as Mr. Isdell knows from Coca-Cola in respect of sugar cane is an important issue here, cereals and foodstuffs and obesity and health, all these things are all part of a tourism industry. So in that sense, that was good. The final point I make is this. You've all heard of the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These are all a critical element of education. But in the commemoration, the centenary commemoration of the seminal event, which was the 1916 Rising, which led on to the War of Independence and eventually independence for Ireland, we commemorated that by the state in a very sensitive way because it was a very sensitive issue. So all the children wrote their pictures and drew their pictures of the General Post Office on fire and all that. Their older brothers and sisters wrote stories, and they wrote the new Constitution of Ireland from their point of view. What would you like to see? And their parents and grandparents recounted stories of families. And out of that came, 5,000-6,000 really creative pieces of writing. So I recognize that your young people have a creativity and an imaginative capacity, which was always there, I suppose, because we've had a disproportionate number of Nobel laureates in literature, and W.B. Yeats and James Joyce and Samuel Beckett and so on. So we actually, when I opened the National Museum in revamped form, we actually inserted the artistic, creative qualities into the STEM subjects and make it a matter of public policy. So instead of STEM, now you've got STEAM, S-T-E, the artistic endeavour. So you get both sides of the human capacity here, which lifts morale and confidence and is a new statement. And I know you can do that in Barbados too.
Thank you. I think
I just have one
the
final
other
question.
point that I wanted to reinforce, Ed, was that, just to clarify, you said you had 2 VAT rates, and the higher VAT rate applied to what?
Applied to the generality of goods and services in the country, whereas the lower one would be to a minority of named activities.
Right.
But the higher one is the standard rate.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand how you actually achieved the significant reduction in the public service. Obviously, it was through transformation of how you did things. So we are going through the same thing here in Barbados, trying to transform how we do things in the public service. What were some of the significant changes that were made to achieve that large reduction, rather than just lay off people? But even if you laid off people, the services still had to be performed. So what actually transformed the way the public service did business? Thanks.
Well, on the public service pay bill, we introduced legislation, and we simply cut the rate of pay right across the board for public service, after we had discussed it with the social partners and the opposition. And we got the legislation through the Parliament pretty well without objection. Now, it wasn't popular, but there was, you see, how will I put it? Like, apart from the kind of hard economics and the economic decisions, anything you can do to build the feeling of a team, and that it's Team Barbados, and it's all for one and one for all, and we're all in this together. And we have to do these things to rescue the country for our children's sake. Once you get that, and any initiative that does that, whether it's social or political, that's very helpful. And it doesn't last indefinitely now. Not to say we have utopia at present. We've all the usual problems of a modern democracy. But for a period of time, it's possible to get society acting as one, because the objective is of such magnitude that you can get coherence of action. And you have to strive for that. And once you get that in, you'll deliver, and you'll get out of your difficulty quickly. If there's a lot of contention and people are pulling in different directions, you'll end up like Greece. In 10 years' time, you'll have the same set of problems, and you'll have suffered a lot of pain in the meantime, but you'll have no result. So that's how it was done. Now, on the numbers in the public service then, what we did on that is we put a ceiling on the numbers in every agency and in every department, but we did not fill vacancies. So over a period of time, the natural erosion and retirements and people leaving, took the numbers down. So there would be quite a big turnover anyway in the Irish civil service every year. After 3 years, it was very significant.
How much?
I don't have the number in my head, but you're talking maybe 30, 40,000.
See, 30, 40,000. Significant. I think the major difference here with us, just to place context, was we did have the luxury of doing what you weren't able to persuade the EU and the IMF, and that is in the debt restructuring. If we did not have the ability to restructure debt, we would have to find a $500 million adjustment to our minimum, which is the savings we've made thus far on interest alone. And the equivalent of $500 million out of a central government wages bill of $780 million tells you the numbers that would have had to either be cut in absolute terms or effectively in real terms in wages would mean that the average person would be getting literally 28, 30 cents in the dollar of their salary. In other words, a 70% wage cut, or sending home the equivalent of about 10,000 workers out of 15,000 workers in central government. So for us, the scale of the bankruptcy was such that we had no choice but to restructure debt. And out of that, therefore, it contained labor being on the front line of the adjustment in a way that on every other previous economic decline in the country's history since independence, workers took the brunt of the adjustment, both in terms of pay cut and dismissals, like in 1991. So my fear is, however, and I'm being very honest, as I have been with the country, that having taken some antibiotics and you start to feel a little better, the extreme pain is not there. And all of a sudden you believe you can stop taking the antibiotics because you feel better without appreciating that the underlying condition has not been cured. And that is why I've tried to say to the country, let us stay the course. Because I sense a level of restlessness on the part of every sector, and I'm not picking out any one sector, from the private sector to the unions. And as you said, once people start to realize that the measures are biting in, yes, we did move certain fruit, for example, from being zero rated to being exempt. So apples and strawberries and those other fruit that are imported into Barbados will see an increase in prices. But the last time I checked, you can still pick golden apples and and passion fruit and dunks and all other kinds of local fruit that are not subject to the taxman or to BRA. So that we have, and I'm glad that Enda, you made the point about the resurgence of local flavor and local foods and basic foods, because I'm looking at Dr. De Silva, and I'm sure that as much as we like English and Irish potato, he'll tell us that sweet potato and breadfruit and eddos are better for us as complex carbohydrates, so that we get a double benefit and not just a single benefit. Similarly, and this is a difficult one, the unions, I have appreciated the extent to which the unions have made the initial journey with us. But there will be obviously pressure, because there are what I call atmospheric noises that would want to cause your membership to feel that you are not being faithful to them, when in truth and in fact you have been utmostly faithful. Because if there is no Barbados that can service their jobs, then instead of there being an adjustment, there will be no property, and in some instances their lives and their liberty will be compromised. But are we there yet? No, we're not. So anytime we can't provide a 24-hour service with respect to healthcare in this country, we're in trouble. Because the people who we are punishing are not the people who have money, but they're the people who have no money to go to Sandy Crest or to FMH, but who have to depend on the public services. Now, I'm satisfied, having met with the ministry yesterday and having listened to the unions, that the rollout of the one polyclinic on a test and fix approach will allow us to be able to roll out, hopefully, the second polyclinic in about 3-4 months, with also the appreciation that we need to make it possible for people to get access to health care when they are in deep and dire pain, because I wouldn't know how to live with that pain. I don't feel anybody else should have to do it. Similarly, we can't build out services with overtime as a core cost, because if overtime is a core cost of a service, it means that it is not sustainable. So I really want to thank you, because what it does for us is to start to place context on the journey that we are walking. And the truth is that there are those who would want, for example, to put the government under fire for continuing with the debt restructuring at the external level. I would not know how to exclude the external debt restructuring, having engaged in the domestic debt restructuring and successfully so. Unfortunately for us, the IMF, rather than back away and prevent it, have in fact encouraged us towards settlement with respect to the debt restructuring. I only want to say that from the beginning, and I think members in here know it, the BERT program was ours. The BERT program has elements of it that, if it was drafted from outside, would not see us paying tuition fees for Barbadian students at the tertiary level. We chose to do that because we understand that education is the way out for all of our people. Similarly, as I told Madame Lagarde on the very first night, 1 week after we met her, we were elected, that you can't go on a long journey without giving people breakfast. And the breakfast that we have given is to be able to give everybody comfort in the island that we need to make this journey together, and that all of us are in this journey together. The growth measures are clearly set out, and this is the parallel program, Michael, that you spoke of, in the BERT program, as well as in the IMF program, which is an encapsulation of the BERT program, which is the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Program. And it's premised on not only reinforcing existing productive sectors like tourism and agriculture, but also looking at the new opportunities and the new sectors within those areas, like within agriculture, with respect to food security, which has to be a major objective for us now in a climate change, in a world that is driven by the threats of climate change. But similarly, the opportunities for medical cannabis. We have to be able to look at the new productive sectors of renewable energy, which, with a 2030 commitment to a fossil fuel-free economy or a carbon-neutral economy at worst, requires that we develop the renewable energy sector in rapid terms in order to be able to replace the $800 million a year roughly that we spend in importing fossil fuels into the country, and the concomitant sectors and support services that go with that. Similarly, that unless we restructure our educational system for the new economy and move away from the 1940s British educational reform that was satisfied to discard 60 to 70% of the population at age 11, we are not going to create global citizens with Barbadian roots ready and capable of working any and every place. And at the same time, in this room, we settled on the RIRI program, not because Rihanna is our iconic Barbadian, but also because we chose for it to stand for retooling, empowering, retraining, and franchising. And the bottom line is, unless we create a platform for ownership, as I said at the ILO last week, in all areas, from the traditional to the new ones that will lead to AI and robots, etc., we are not going to be able to control our destiny without ownership being a feature of it. But secondly, that we need to retrain at all levels, from car washer to prime minister, from waiter to doctors and engineers and teachers, to redefine for each sector what constitutes excellence, how we are going to train to excellence, how we can certify, if possible, to excellence, but most importantly, how we are going to monitor the habit of excellence, because excellence is a habit that needs to be monitored and maintained. And hence, government is about to engage in the largest retraining program within the private and public sector over the course of the next 4 years, because we need to change how we relate to what we do in the hardcore aspects of what our job is, but what I also call the softer side, which is really aspects of citizenship in terms of how we relate to one another. Similarly, we have to restructure the institutions that are no longer appropriate for our 21st century Barbados, and the systems, by asking the question, how do we change? What is it that we protect in the public purpose? What is it that we need to do to fight against the public mischief? And how do we integrate technology to make our delivery more effective and efficient? And at the last point, how do we do so while not discriminating against a class, but also creating a platform for enfranchisement of those in our system who can be enfranchised because of the changes in the system? And the last part is that you cannot close. No system that survives when it looks inward. It atrophies. And I don't know how to thank you for the continued reference today and yesterday, and for the fact that you have to move from being inward-looking and protectionist to being confident and optimistic and engaging with those around us. We need oxygen as human beings to survive. Our country needs oxygen to survive in this world. And therefore, the most important gift that we can give to our people is the gift of confidence and optimism and opportunity. And that is why the long-term goal of this government is that by 2030, every Barbadian child under the age of 18 must be able to swim, because you can't live on an island while being afraid of the boundaries around you. Must be able to be bilingual, given the opportunity, because you must be able to engage in this hemisphere and in this world. Must have been given an opportunity to learn an artistic discipline, because as you correctly said, you need that compassion, that other part of your brain to engage, to function well, and to live well with people. And if you learn a sport, you learn the principles of teamwork more often than not, that teach you more than anything else you can learn in life, because it teaches you how to function in a society. And then finally, must be given the opportunities to learn how to be an entrepreneur and to take risks and to accept it, because for the years we heard all through the decades, Barbadians are not entrepreneurs. But yet we see people taking risks in communities, doing legal and illegal things every day. Barbadians are not shareholders, but yet we have a credit union movement that has over 100,000 shareholders, Governor, in a population that is just under 300,000, 280. It is the equivalent of us. Are there 120 million shareholders in the United States of America? Because that's what the equivalent number would be. And we therefore need to look at ourselves and see ourselves differently, and to put in place those things to be able to create those opportunities for the taking of risk. And finally, as I said, we have to accept, very difficult, that we may not have enough people to sustain the quality of life that we've become accustomed to. And to that extent, we need hard scientific evidence for a National Population Commission, just as we need hard scientific evidence for an independent commission for minimum wages. And we need to be able to make these decisions to open up and to remove the closed shops, be it in the medical profession, in the legal profession, in every other closed shop that exists, but also in the assumed wisdoms that have become part and parcel, in my view, of the problem that we've had in this country. And to that extent, one of them is that we are overpopulated, when in truth and in fact, it's actually the opposite. And what we need to be able to do is to look at it scientifically, and if necessary, have managed migration. Who are the skills that we need? I want people to come here and teach the same artificial intelligence, the same coding, the same robotics, 3D printing. Why can't we make drones in this country? Why do we have to import? Why aren't we using the skills of our people to be able to do the very things that make a difference? We can't be all things to all people, but we can choose one or two things to do well and do them. And finally, that as we open up not only to foreign investment and manage migration, we need to open up too in terms of how we conduct our relations, both with our diaspora, but also with the other parts of the world. This year, we opened an embassy in Panama and in Ghana. One country is the country from which the majority of us came. The other country is a country to which more Barbadians went at a time to build the Panama Canal than any other country in the world contributed workers. We were the largest number of workers going to open up the Panama Canal at the turn of the 20th century. But equally, we have to claim our Atlantic destiny. And claiming our Atlantic destiny means open up commercial offices and presence in Ireland, in Morocco, and doing things that have been non-traditional. Do we need to put 20 and 30 people? No. But do we need to have 3 and 4 people who are linking back through this with the population and offices at home? Yes, we do. So I really want to thank you, gentlemen, all 3 of you, for helping to share perspective. Because more than anything else, in the sharing of your story and your experiences, what you do is give us context and perspective. And we have, each of us in this room, to ask ourselves, have we made the sacrifices of the last year to fail? Or have we made the sacrifices of the last year to win and achieve? I have said privately that my greatest ambition is for us to be able to get out of the 4-year program before the end of the 4-year program. Is it possible? I don't know. But I do know that if we work together, we have a chance. But if we don't work together, we have absolutely no chance of it. And what does getting out of the program mean, Michael? It means being able to borrow at rates that are more affordable and better, and that allows us to reclaim absolute control of our destiny in every sense. If we know anything about Barbados and Barbadians, it is that there is that equally fair sense of pride, and I believe that the Irish have helped to contribute to it, that wants to be able to control their own destiny, and finds itself perhaps greatest in the expression of how we engage non-Barbadians, that we are friends of all and satellites of none. And we say that because that is really the ultimate expression that no one can control us but ourselves. Or as Marcus Garvey would say, that we have chosen to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery and also from other physical bonds, because freedom is fundamentally about choice. And if we don't have choice as workers, or we don't have choice as capital, private sector, or we don't have choice as government, then we are not emancipated in any form or fashion. And our role is to give back to our people that sense of pride, to give them, and that sense of emancipation, to give them choice to be able to claim their destiny. So, gentlemen, I really, really, really want to thank you for being here. I have a little something for you. I know that if I were in Ireland, you'd probably be telling me about Jameson and whiskey, but you're in Barbados. And I therefore have to tell you that the story of Barbados is the story of rum. And the story of rum is the story of Barbados. And I know that if you go back and you take this with you, I have every confidence that apart from the warmth of relations of our people and the warmth of the experience, this will take you over the edge to cause you to come back.
Thank you very much. Don't open it until you get home.
And I'm not being unfair to Neville. I'm going to give him a hug and a kiss, but he has his ready supply of Barbados gold as a patron. I'd like to say to those of you here, I am conscious that this is Saturday morning, and I am conscious that many of you could have chosen to be elsewhere, and I'm conscious that many of you have chosen to come, and I want really to thank you for taking the opportunity and making the decision to come and to allow us to be able to learn from these experiences, to be gracious in our hospitality towards these three gentlemen. But above all else, I'm conscious that your presence here is a commitment to work with us as one people to stay the course. And above all else, that is the first ingredient to our success. Thank you.
Before you go, we just want to take your seats so that we can proceed with the vote of thanks. Political activist Helen Keller once said, and I quote, "Alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much." Honorable Prime Minister and Chairman of the Social Partnership Committee, Mayor Amor Mottley, members of the Social Partnership, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to first direct a heartfelt thank you to you for affording me the opportunity to propose a vote of thanks in a setting such as this. I, on the behalf of the Social Partnership Committee, would like to express profound gratitude to Mr. Enda Kenny, former Prime Minister of Ireland, and Mr. Michael Noonan, former Minister of Finance, and to you, Mr. Neville Isdell, for taking the time from your schedules to share your knowledge, experiences, and your expertise to what I see as an investment in the development of our island's economic growth and stability. I extend sincere appreciation to you, Madam Prime Minister, for facilitating today's fruitful discussions as we seek to endeavor on the way forward to recovery. Thank you to all of our partners for your continuous efforts and support of the Social Partnership. I know that what we have discussed today at this meeting will not be in vain, but rather that we will take the information that has been shared and adapt it to our culture and to our present strategic methodologies for the betterment of Barbados. I end with the words of industrialist Andrew Carnegie. Teamwork is the ability to work together toward a common vision. It is the ability to direct individual accomplishments toward organizational objectives. It is the fuel that allows common people to attain uncommon results. Ladies and gentlemen, as we have been reminded here today, the journey to economic recovery has only just begun. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a concise and well-said vote of thanks. And to each of you, thank you once again, and have a wonderful and blessed weekend. For those who are joining us as we, this afternoon, rename the Spring Garden Highway to the Mighty Griner Highway, I look forward to seeing you later. Thank you.